Hello, welcome to my book club. My name is Hunter. I'm a therapist, and in this series, I want to read different therapy books and give you my thoughts and opinions as a mental health therapist. The first book in this series is going to be Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson. And in today's video, we are going to start with the introduction. As we go through, I'm just going to show you what different things that I highlighted and then talk about some of the notes I wrote in the margins. The first thing that I highlighted was this sentence. Emotional neglect in childhood leads to a painful emotional loneliness that can have a long-term negative impact on a person's choices regarding relationships and intimate partners. The next thing I highlighted was emotionally immature parents fear genuine emotion and pull back from emotional closeness. They use coping mechanisms that resist reality rather than dealing with it. They don't welcome self-reflection, so they rarely accept blame or apologize. And at the end of that, Gibson says, when parents are emotionally immature, their children's emotional needs will almost always lose out to the parents' own survival instincts. I had several thoughts on this. My first thought was of this cycle when she says a long term negative impact on a person's choices. If your parents raised you like that, are you destined to follow in their footsteps? The next thing I thought of was avoidance, because it sounds like emotionally immature parents are so busy with their fight or flight, their survival needs, that they just avoid emotions altogether. Not just their kids, but also their own. What I found interesting next was that Gibson talks about myths and fairy tales depicting neglectful parents. She talks about how these stories have been around for centuries because they touch on a common chord, how children must fend for themselves after their parents have neglected or abandoned them. That was a cool moment of self-reflection, actually, to think of how many stories, both myths and fairy tales, but also modern stories, feature neglectful parents. Down in the middle of that page, I highlighted this. Knowing about differences in emotional maturity gives you a way of understanding why you can feel so emotionally lonely in spite of other people's claims of love and kinship. Finally, I highlighted that among psychotherapists, it's long been known that emotionally disengaging from toxic parents is the way to restore peace and self sufficiency. But how does one do this? We do it by understanding what we are dealing with. For both of those things, I wrote that being aware is step number one. And even if you are aware, I wrote that it's kind of easier said than done, making boundaries with your parents. I appreciate Gibson including this in the introduction because it's important. Concise little quote that I highlighted was this part. Their neglect wasn't about us, but about them. It plays into the awareness that Gibson just talked about. I loved how it was so short, but just really well put. Their neglect wasn't about us, but about them. I thought it was a great quote. Near the end of the introduction, Gibson just kind of goes through the rest of the chapters of the book, sort of as an outline. So in chapter one, you'll see why people who grew up with emotionally immature parents often feel emotional loneliness. Chapters 2 and 3 will describe characteristics of emotionally immature parents and the types of relationship problems they cause. Chapter 4 describes four main types of emotionally immature parents. Chapter 5, you'll see how people lose touch with their true selves in order to take on a family role, describing two very different types of children, internalizers and externalizers. In chapter 6, Gibson describes the internalizer personality in greater detail. In chapter 7, Gibson addresses what happens when old patterns of relating finally break down and people begin to wake up to their unmet needs. Kind of a turning point in the book, I think. In chapter 8, Gibson will introduce a way of relating to people that she calls the maturity awareness approach, seeing behavior in a more objective way and observing the defining signs of immaturity as they occur. I'm interested to learn more. In chapter 9, you'll hear about individuals who have experienced a new sense of freedom and wholeness after using this approach. I did write critical because, of course, if you're going to put testimonials in your book, they're going to be successful, probably. So I'll be interested to hear those stories and maybe take a critical look at them. Chapter 10 describes how to identify people who will treat you well and be emotionally safe and reliable. Gibson then says, after reading this book, you will be able to spot signs of emotional immaturity and understand why you've often felt alone. You will learn to manage the overdeveloped empathy and recognize people who are capable of genuine emotional intimacy and satisfying communication. She ends the introduction by saying, if it helps you to see yourself as a worthy person who is no longer at the mercy of other people's manipulations, I will have done my job. I wish the very best for you. My biggest takeaway from the introduction was that awareness and mindfulness skills are foundation. I do wonder if Gibson will touch on any skills to build self-awareness to question immature parents. I also wonder if she's going to touch on people pleasing. That's kind of a broader scope that's not necessarily parents, but I wonder if people who are raised by emotionally immature parents tend to struggle with people pleasing. I'd be interested to learn. Thank you so much for reading the introduction with me. Come back next week where we tackle chapter 1. I'll see you then.